Hey everybody, it's RJ, your host, and welcome to Hash It Out. You may have heard about the federal cannabis legalization bill recently presented in the U.S. Senate by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senator Ron Wyden, and Senator Cory Booker. But what if I told you that the bill doesn't actually legalize cannabis, as has been reported by many major news outlets? In this episode, I'll be speaking with Maggie Connors of Besito to clarify the language of the draft Senate bill. We'll also discuss the proper implementation of social equity programs in the cannabis industry, how Los Angeles's social equity program hasn't lived up to its promise, what it's like to double as an entrepreneur and a community organizer in the cannabis industry, and more. Without further ado, let's hash it out. All right. My guest today is the founder and CEO of the cannabis company Besito LA and the VP of marketing at the cannabis company Sparc. Welcome to the show, Maggie Connors. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to ask you about all that's going on in the world of cannabis. There is, of course, a lot to talk about going on out there, particularly with the Senate bill being among the top news in the zeitgeist as of last week when it was announced. And so I just want to dive right in here and ask you about that, and then we'll get into some of the work that you're doing over at Sparc and over at Besito. So starting with the Schumer decriminalization bill, and I specify that it's a decriminalization bill because, you know, many major news outlets ever since the bill was submitted have sort of been interchanging the words decriminalization and legalization, almost equating them as if they're the same sort of thing. You and I know, of course, that there are massive differences between legalization and decriminalization of cannabis on a federal level. But to clarify for our viewers and apparently all of the major news outlets out there, what are the major differences between decriminalization and legalization, and how do you see the interchanging of those terms potentially causing confusion for those out there?
Yes, it's certainly harmful. And I think, like so much of our work, and I've been in cannabis for 5 years now, is it's on us to educate. And, you know, we're dealing with 100 years of government propaganda against us. And so, and all this stigma founded in nonsense for the most part. So absolutely, it doesn't surprise me sort of that it's one more regulatory topic that we need to clarify. I think first, I just want to call out, I think it was less than a year ago that the first cannabis at all bill went to the federal level, went to the House. And so I believe this is sort of the second version only. And just to say, this is brand new. What we've seen play out over the last 20 years, but really the last 5 to 7, is state by state legalization. And so legalization is the end of prohibition, but also the foundation for an industry that's regulated and taxed. And so very clear laws about how folks will, typically in cannabis, get a license, what they're able to do with that license, what they can't do with that license, clear parameters on how we will grow, manufacture, and sell cannabis in our own states, and make money for the state through taxes, which of course is a big impetus for these laws changing. And so now we have however many 30 plus states between medical and recreational full legalization. The difference with this federal bill is decriminalization. And so the key part there is sort of what it sounds like. You will not be criminalized. There will not be charges against you for personal possession or use of cannabis. And so in general, and it gets murky as all things do, the government is agreeing to not spend dollars, energy having police or other government law enforcers prosecute folks with cannabis. It's sort of turn the other cheek, but that's where it gets murky. And then the
Right.
other thing to be really clear about is you could still be prosecuted for manufacturing, selling, sort of that business side that's really part of legalization.
Mm-hmm.
And so decriminalization, it's a first step. It's not full federal legalization that we're all sort of talking about and waiting for, which we know will help enable the legal business, which right now is limited to a state by state industry. You can't cross state lines whatsoever. Um, this is a step towards that, but it is not that. And
Mm.
so the issue is I see it with decriminalization. And I do think it's a step in the right direction, and the bill itself got better. Um, there will be less folks going to jail. And of course, the history of cannabis is that we've sent millions, mostly Black and brown men, to jail for operating cannabis, which now the legal industry is making billions off of. So
Right.
at the core of it, I like the theory. The issue is it's murky. So
Mm.
while you may not be criminally convicted to court, you may get a ticket. And then if you don't pay a ticket, you might be arrested. And so it can snowball in a way that's not right for individuals. And the other thing I think it lacks is the theory of decriminalization, because other countries have done it.
Mm.
I think it's Portugal that had decriminalized all drugs years ago. In theory, it helps reduce the burden on the system and sort of focused to more important things, is kind of what it's saying, that this is no longer sort of their top issue. But what it lacks is the social and mental health and addiction support that would be required to kind of keep this a safe system. To say this is a health issue, a societal issue, okay, great, but then like folks would need support accordingly.
Mm.
So it's not sort of the full answer. And then of course it doesn't create federal business. And so that's where we've seen so far sort of private and public interests most align. Again, back to the taxes and the money side,
Mm.
which is invested in most states into great programs that do help with addiction, children's education, all sorts of anti-opiates. So it's a step in the right direction, I believe, at sort of the individual level, but it does not solve for kind of this inflection point that everyone's waiting for, where we will have a federal cannabis industry that's not restricted to state by state. And that's what I think will really not only unlock business, but help fight the stigma and help. Right now it's on pocket. So here we are in Southern
Right.
California. Cannabis is like such a part of our culture. It's so
Yeah.
normal to have weed everywhere, to bring it to a dinner party, your grandma, whatever.
Yeah.
And there are certainly other places in the country where that's being, there's nothing like that. It's still, capital D drug and scary, and the risk of prosecution. And so I do think it's going to take that federal legalization to really change hearts and minds, laws, the money side,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I think that's the main difference.
Yeah. And you mentioned the disproportionate incarceration of individuals, mostly, as you mentioned, Black and brown men, for simple cannabis possession, even as, in this day and age, as, like you said, state legal industries are generating these multi-billion-dollar corporations that now exist in this country, even though we still have the federal illegality of cannabis. All that being said, is a reason why, of course, social equity is such a big priority when it comes to advocacy for cannabis policy reform in this country on a federal level or even a state and local level. Besito, which I understand just recently completed a partnership with Sparc based in NorCal last month. Besito is, from what I understand, a women-founded, queer-led company with a mission to make premium cannabis products and a space for women, BIPOC, and the LGBTQIA plus community within the industry. Besito is based in LA, and Los Angeles's own social equity program has received some pretty sharp criticism since its implementation, and has been scrutinized for actually causing more harm for BIPOC and minority business owners, rather than assisting them in entering the market. Retail licenses meant for social equity applicants were actually given out online on a first come, first served basis. And for those who weren't there right when they hit online, well, they actually went online before the scheduled time, which meant really that whoever was on their computer hitting refresh at the time and whoever had the fastest internet at the time just got the license. And because of that, it turned out that out of the 100 business licenses that were granted, only 18 of them ended up being Black owned. And for those Black owned, brown owned, women owned, minority owned businesses, even if you get a license, it doesn't stop, it doesn't pave the way for success because, for example, the 18 Black owned businesses in LA have been facing problems with investors backing out, leaving their storefronts still empty, even though they have a license to operate. The backlash was so strong in LA that the LA mayor, Eric Garcetti, actually ordered an audit of the social equity program. And then if you look on a nationwide level, minorities only make up about 1% of the industry across America at this time. So my question for you is just, how do we make sure that social equity programs actually do what they were meant to do?
Yeah. And my answer is a bit of a detour, but where I landed coming into the industry 5 years ago is, given how difficult these social equity licensing programs are and potentially problematic, and there's predatory concerns and have been predatory investors. Mm-hmm. And just as you were saying, it just doesn't make sense. Folks are supposed to be, by definition, folks who have maybe made under $40,000 a year are meant to be paying rent for years while they wait. And then they're meant to be running multi-million-dollar companies, which maybe some folks have that skill set, but again, by definition, it's unlikely.
Sure.
Anyways, because they're so messy, what I decided 5 years ago is, as an entrepreneur, I and I don't think the rest of the industry can kind of sit back and rely on equity being infused in regulations. And of course, I think that's important, and I've helped support the groups that are leading that work. I do not lead that work, but I like to support those that do. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, I think there's a lot that we as sort of private operators in the space can be doing anyway, in the meantime, in addition to equity licensing.
Sure.
So that's been a few things for me over the years. When we started Besito, this is something I've always been passionate about, is acknowledging the racist history of prohibition, talking about the war on drugs and the effects, and then talking about advocates today and groups leading the work today and how we can support them. So sure. For me, it's and as a business owner, or really a decision maker in any role, I have hiring decisions. I can choose who we work with on our supply chain, what vendor we go with. And I really encourage folks to think about this. I really believe we can bring equity in cannabis to decisions we make every single day. Even bringing folks onto the team or giving them your business is helping involve folks of color in the industry. Are they the CEOs of license holding companies? No, but nor am I. That I did not want to do that. That's a huge thing to take on.
Right.
And I see that as taking a few dozen folks you know, from whatever line sort of the definition is, to hopefully intergeneral wealth. But how can we take more folks just into the industry at all
Mm-hmm.
levels, um, and have them profiting off the industry, certainly with salary or wage, but ideally with ownership in a company as well. And so sort of my philosophy, and then on top of that have infused it into the brand. And I think for us it's like we have this platform.
Yeah.
I would be remiss to not address this and educate on it. And so in 2019, we did a campaign called "A Record Shouldn't Last a Lifetime," where we announced a partnership with Equity First Alliance at the time. We built it into our business model. So 1% of all sales go to different, mostly Black-led groups, leading equity work in some way or the other in cannabis nationally. And then we put our marketing budget towards some content that was just sort of Besito presents, but then this incredible, mostly folks of color, mostly queer cast and crew created this short 10-minute documentary that was highlighting the folks here in LA most affected by the war on drugs, and putting, giving their putting faces to stories, and talking about how we can be conscious consumers today, and choose brands that are doing the work, and go to dispensaries that are run by Black women, and there aren't nearly enough, but being educated consumers matters, like every single purchase. And actually it's more than matters. I think it's a privilege to be not only operating in the industry, but even to be a consumer in the legal cannabis industry with folks. And again, this going to jail, this isn't 10 years ago, it's yesterday. It's just in other parts of the country. And so, there's just so much injustice that I do think we as companies can be working on it too. And what my last little plug here, about a year ago, I helped start a group led by Cannaclusive, that's called Cannabis for Black Lives. And the idea was that we have this coalition of dozens of cannabis companies, and we can all have a bigger impact by working together. So anyways, anyone's welcome to join, any size of company, geography, sort of function, but we choose different Black-led groups for 2 months, and we help them, we amplify their message, and we help with on the financial front too. People do a lot of give back programs through products. And then we also take a look at these companies and their hiring practices and their employee makeup. And it's something we measure over time and hold folks accountable. Because again, we have these amazing companies, big and small. And while I can't really affect the legalization laws and equity licensing process, in the meantime, we can be supporting these groups now and getting them what they need, and also taking a look at most of these white-owned companies and how they can do better, both hiring and culture, and being aware of what's going on and working towards it. So I'm a believer in everyone can be doing something every day on this issue, and should be.
And that leads me to ask you, I'm wondering how optimistic you are about the future of the cannabis industry if and when there is federal cannabis policy reform here in this country. Because, obviously it's still federally illegal, but you already have these multi-billion-dollar, multi-state operator companies here in this country. Particularly, a company such as MedMen, which is run by, another rich white man who has said before, I saw a video of him saying something along the lines of how he can't possibly be racist because he has a Latina wife and a half Latina child, which is certainly something that I have heard throughout my time here as a human in this country, a person of color in this country in particular. So, one of the ways to promote social equity is, of course, to get people of color and minority communities in those positions, in those influential positions. But I mean, those positions are already taken massively by rich white men. And so what are your thoughts and predictions on the future of cannabis legalization in terms of the corporatization of it all? You know, the Amazon Kush and the Walmart weeds of it all. How do we make sure that we carve out a space for those who are actually tending to the community to play a role in the industry?
Yep. I think it's bleak at the same time, you know, currently when you look at the numbers. But I also am optimistic because it is the beginning of this industry. And even though I've been in 5 years, feels like 10, and folks have certainly been in it much longer and advocating much longer than I have. But it's still the first inning, I would say. And so there are folks leading this work. Can-Inclusive, Supernova Women in Oakland and the Bay Area, and tons of other groups that we're supporting sort of at the state-by-state level. But they have power, and they have affected state-by-state legalization, social equity groups, and bills being rewritten to include better equity. So I have to stay optimistic because otherwise it's too depressing, but everyone also has to be working on it. And not just lawmakers and these groups, but people with money and a lot of these, you know, big corporate MSOs. I think the other sort of good news is because we're a nascent industry, again, it's like been around forever, but it legacy market. But it's changing, and there aren't sort of in other industries. I come from the beverage industry.
Yeah.
There aren't 100 years, or think about banking and finance, 150, 200 years of how things have been done and who runs them. And it's white men. And so now is the opportunity, now is the chance to say we're demanding that half of an exec team is women, and that it's made out of, we're comprised of folks of color. And so just sort of amplifying these voices, and they're out there now, and more, it's not just nonprofits. From my perspective, it's companies are shouting that this is something, especially in cannabis, that has to be acted on. And I'm also hopeful because we are starting to see management teams of some of these companies shift. And there's more and more pressure. And as companies grow and are hiring executives from other industries, they can be women and folks of color. And it's just that we have to keep demanding it and explaining why it's better for business and why it's the right thing to do as far as cannabis equity. And it's more reflective of cannabis consumers. And so when you think about brands and products, and this is for any industry, but yeah, especially in cannabis, I think mandating this, continuing to advocate, and then again, continuing to act, even if in whatever sort of decision-making power capabilities one has in the industry, still doing what you can and being loud about the history of this industry. Because it got better about a year ago, but I was always shocked how many cannabis brands were just la-di-da, gummies on a hike. And like, I really think good brands can do both. Like, you can talk about taking a rocket ship to the moon, but you can also be addressing this plant that we're all profiting from and how we do better.
And you mentioned that on the day in which a certain very, very rich man recently took his rocket into space this morning. So
yes, that's the literal version.
That's the literal manifestation of what we're talking about here. My last question. Yes, please go ahead.
Cannabis can help send you to space as well, and it'll last longer than 10 minutes. So.
Exactly that, and you'll see a lot more too. I imagine it was just very dark up there. Um, But my last question for you before I let you go here is, you're an entrepreneur, but in the cannabis industry in particular, which is one of the many ways that it differentiates itself from other industries, entrepreneurs in the cannabis industry often have to double as advocates, as activists, as community organizers within their regions or their localities, whether it is in terms of promoting social equity or record expungement or healthcare accessibility or legislation progression in the state or federal level. Besito's website says, quote, "It's a privilege to partake in this industry, but it's also our responsibility to step up and work towards change." Now, that's something that you've been speaking about throughout our conversation here. So I'm just curious about you personally. What is it like for you to sort of be that bridge between being an entrepreneur and being an advocate? And what is it like for you to balance those two? And were you expecting that? Were you expecting having to do that coming into the industry?
Yeah, that's why I came into the industry. I've always loved cannabis. I had come from consumer products and brands, so I sort of loved the idea of a new aesthetic and point of view and bringing my brand and product skills to the space. But ultimately, what got me involved was my anger at the injustice and at the misinformation. And I knew, I'm attaching my face to cannabis, starting in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And, what is coming from more sort of a traditional big brand background, that was a decision, And so anyways, I certainly do not consider myself like a capital A advocate and acknowledge those who really day by day fought for laws to change. As an entrepreneur, especially with investors, my job was to make money and to make them more money. and so I just want to acknowledge that. That being
Sure.
said, absolutely, it's every single day. And it started with telling my parents, I was graduating from business school, I'm actually going to go into weed. And they were shocked. And sort of changing hearts and minds, like sometimes one person at a time. And then when, you have the privilege of having a platform like Besito does, telling the industry and using that brand platform. But also it's really just how I live. So one example is back to my business school class. We just had our 5-year reunion. They kindly voted me to speak at it about my career the last 5 years.
Wow.
And even just, 30 minutes with this group of a few hundred smart folks, they don't know a lot of what I was educating them on. They don't know the racist history of prohibition and how inequitable it still is today. They don't know about the endocannabinoid system and that cannabis regulates homeostasis and we produce them ourselves. They're still thinking back to DARE propaganda when we were 10 or 15. And so I think it's just one example of this is living it. And it's sort of, it's an argument at a dinner party that I never mean to get into, but then I'm going to talk about the plants and the benefits.
Sure.
So yes, I've become an advocate. Although one thing I will say is I also think it's important to talk about the negatives. And I find a lot of us, of course, are so passionate about the plant that we shout its praises all day. And I trust all of them. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to acknowledge, brain development before 25. What are we doing about driving? Some of these, issues that I think it makes us more sort of aware advocates to talk about both.
Certainly. Yeah, it's, I totally agree with you. We tend to paint a rosy picture about cannabis, but it's important to have that objectivity and address the real issues that do exist and the questions that have yet to be answered. And so I thank you very much, Maggie, for offering your perspective and all you've got going on, and sharing a little more information and clarifying for our viewers about the latest going on in terms of the federal cannabis decriminalization bill, and all that you're doing over at Besito to not only bring cannabis to the people around you, but also advocate and call for the social equity and the legislative changes and the accessibility that we desperately need in this country if we want to establish a cannabis industry that it truly is equitable for all. And so I thank you very much, Maggie, for coming on and sharing all of that. Please continue all of the good work, and we will certainly be keeping track of all you've got going on over there.
Thank you so much. Great to chat.
Absolutely. Maggie Connors, everybody, thank you so much for joining me. That is it for Hash It Out, y'all. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Peace out. Hey, everybody. Thanks for checking out our channel. Click here to watch another episode of Hash It Out. To find more cannabis industry reporting, insider stories, and to stay up to date on the latest trends, make sure to subscribe and keep up with our Trichomes community app. Download it now for free, and we'll see you there.